So at this time, we will begin our roundtable, and we're just delighted to have Dr. Patricia Jones with us today to share, and she's going to kick our roundtable off today. So we're really excited to have her from OSP. So she's, I think, ready to go, and we'll just get her going.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Patricia Jones. I had the pleasure of greeting you yesterday morning. I've been logging in and out. This is a high volume meeting day today, but I was able to hear some of the presentations earlier, and this has truly been a really rich and informative meeting. And I'm only sorry that I wasn't able to stay logged on for the duration. So let me share my screen so you can see. Can you see my slides now?
Yes. Yes,
Perfect.
we can see them.
So I will just say from the outset, I appreciate the rich information and the detail that's been shared. I am going to just give you a slight overview of a few projects that are underway to give you an appreciation of the variety across the Institute of what is funded both in the ADRD space and other areas of interest to aging research, where large data sets are being leveraged to answer important questions related to health disparity or minority health specifically. Yesterday and today, you heard from my colleagues, Dr. Bandiera and Bhattacharya, who are both in the Division of Behavioral and Social Research. So today, I will focus my presentation on, as I mentioned, the other parts of our institute. I think part of what is unique about the National Institute on Aging is the way we're organized and where these important activities happen. So I'll do a little bit of an overview of our organizational structure and then round out with a few comments. Before I get into the details, I just want to point your attention to one document that you're probably familiar with, but I heard yesterday there was some interest around priorities and what might be of interest in data analytics. And if you've not had an opportunity to review our strategic directions document, it is in place from 2020 through 2025. Section G, Goal G, specifically G5, might be of interest to you. So I just want to bring that to your attention. Goal G speaks to support of infrastructure and resources that are needed to promote high quality aging research and lots of objectives that speak directly to innovative analytic and data collection activities. As I mentioned, I'm with the Office of Special Populations. It's one of 4 offices within the Office of the Director, led by Dr. Hodis and Dr. Bernard. Aging biology is led by Dr. Kohansky. We've heard from our colleagues in behavioral and social research. The Division of Geriatrics and Clinical Gerontology is led by Dr. Hadley, and Neuroscience led by Dr. Maslia. To give you an example of neuroscience, just moving quickly into some examples, this activity is specifically related to our Alzheimer's disease sequencing project, or ADSP. It's a large consortium of a number of projects where activities may be supported either in part or wholly by the National Institute on Aging. Oftentimes we collaborate with other institutes or centers that have a common interest, and we will leverage resources and infrastructure to address a specific endpoint. These are just some of the examples of various activities that are associated with the cohorts of for heart and aging research and genomic epidemiology, or CHARGE. Another example would be the ERIC Neurocognitive study, which is intended to influence the vascular disease on cognitive impairments. There are about 16,000 individuals that have been recruited from 1987 to date, with a very diverse population of participants, including Hispanic, African American, as well as Caucasian participants. And again, this is not an exhaustive list of studies, but these are projects that have been funded in part by Heart, Lung, and Blood and National Institute on Aging, where large data sets are available to answer important disparity questions. Another collaborative project would be the Bogalusa Heart Study, which is based out of Bogalusa, Louisiana, looking at young people who are recruited from K through 12 schools and followed over time, looking at cardiovascular disease. About 3,500 of the participants have been followed up to date, with 1,300 have actually completed in-person examinations. The questions are looking at behaviors and physiological developments from childhood through late midlife in rural and other communities where there are a large number of African-American residents. Another example would be the Regards Project. Again, a large national cohort. The team is looking at understanding higher rates of stroke and other vascular related diseases that affect the brain health that may occur more frequently among people in the South and African Americans. Oftentimes, I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase the stroke belt. So this particular project is trying to better understand what are some of the conditions related to that. The study has enrolled over 30,000 African American and white participants to date. There is also the MESA project, or Multi-Ethnic Study of Atherosclerosis. This project has been running for quite some time with over 20 years of data collected on determinants, prevalence, and the progression of subclinical vascular conditions with, again, a very broad representation of people in their study population, including African American, Hispanic, and Asian, and Caucasian. There are some subsidiary projects related to MESA. There's MESA VASCAD, and from that, there's one that's focusing specifically on ADRD pathology, or MESA Mind. And we have also a project that is looking within our aging biology division, not necessarily ADRD focused, but looking at osteoporosis. And this is looking at the comprehensive identification of genes, the gastrointestinal bacterial species and their products and functional mechanisms that may be related to different susceptibilities to developing osteoporosis later in life. The objective is to be able to define and characterize in vivo various epigenes, the species of bacteria, and the environmental factors that are related to these mechanisms. And this particular study has about 75% individuals who are of racial ethnic minority background, with 20,000 people enrolled at this time. Moving to our division of geriatrics and clinical gerontology, again, looking more broadly across aging research, there is a project looking at changes in morbidity and disability among racial and ethnically older adults. The team is using health and retirement study data. This is looking specifically at middle-aged, non-Hispanic Black adults who started at a higher level of chronic disease burden and developed multimorbidity earlier on in life, and on average, as compared to non-white counterparts. Another example is also looking at multi-morbidity in geographically different American populations, looking at patterns by age, sex, and ethnicity. Some of you may be familiar with this particular study known as the Swan Study, or the study of women's health across the nation. It was actually recently, as of Saturday, March 6th, featured in the Washington Post newspaper. We're usually a little nervous when we hear of studies that make it into the paper, but this was certainly a good account of findings that may help improve clinical practice down the road. This particular project is looking prospectively at women who are 42 to 52 years of age, looking at functioning and psychological well-being, cardiovascular health, as well as musculoskeletal health and functioning. There are over 3,300 women that have been recruited, and across 7 different sites across the nation. about 28% of the individuals in the study are African American, about 9% Hispanic, and 16% are Japanese and Chinese descent. There is a subsidiary project looking specifically at aging questions that are related to racial and ethnic disparities in health outcomes. And so these are just a few examples within our Geriatrics and Clinical Gerontology division. But I also want to draw your eye as you, of course, we're in the midst of COVID, and there's some important questions related to health disparities that are before us. There is a project looking at the registry available at the Massachusetts General Hospital. Among hospitalized patients were included in the analysis were Hispanic patients who were younger and had fewer comorbidities as compared to white non-Hispanic patients. And this was in terms of ICU care or mortality. There is also a anti-VEGF antibody study looking at sex and race differences. And this particular study is a single medical center treatment study looking at outcomes using cohort survival analysis. So I will just stop there in terms of the overview of various types of projects. As I mentioned, we have several. That was just a snippet of a few examples that straddle a broad range of fields, ADRD and other aging research related questions. Clearly, we support research with ADRD. We're very interested in understanding and redressing disparities as it pertains to specific activities and events related to this particular condition. And as evidenced by the projects that I've shared, there's rich opportunities for engaging and supporting investigators in both directly and indirectly through lots of partnerships that are in place among the various institutes and centers at NIH. Disparities limit all of our older persons from fully benefiting from these clinical and just other types of discoveries. And we're very interested in our investigators leveraging the resources that are available, including large data sets to provide additional information to answer important questions regarding disparities and promoting minority health. So I will stop there. I'm sure you'll have additional questions and want to have more detailed conversation. These are some of our individuals within the respective divisions. We have a new person who joined us in the fall of last year, Dr. Damali Martin, in neuroscience. More general questions around health disparities might be directed to Dr. Martin. And some of the projects that I highlighted today that were related to the neuroscience portfolio, Dr. Dallas Anderson is available to have conversations around data sets and other efforts that I did not mention today. And if you have questions related to the ADSP or sequencing project, Dr. Marilyn Miller is an excellent point of contact there as well. And these are other people across the other divisions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. Let me see if I can, make sure my face is showing there. But there's so much going on that we as investigators can take advantage of. So we really appreciate your being here today and sharing with us. We have several pieces of our roundtable, and basically it's designed for people to ask questions and to share and to clarify anything that might have, any question that might have gotten cut short because of time. And so I'm gonna ask, let's see, Dr. Yashin, I believe, has some comments to make, and I know, Dr. Jones, there will be questions for you as well. So thank you very much for that. So I'm going to ask Dr. Yashin to come forward. He has some genetics related comments that he wanted to make at this time, and then we'll open things up for questions and answers. And I know Igor is going to come up as well after you.
Okay, could I just start from one point which I think is very important for us to understand? More than 25 years, I think, people in Alzheimer's disease, researchers in Alzheimer's disease, explore the idea of beta amyloids And the deeper they go, the more interesting it became. So they still have the idea that beta amyloid is a key player in this game. And also there are many evidence that beta amyloid is part of some general, let's say, response to different kinds of disturbances. And in particular, beta amyloid could play the role of antibacterial peptide. And so different ideas about how beta amyloid could spread also exist. And it turns out that in order to start the disease propagation, the beta amyloid could be transformed from one neuron to another through synaptic connections. And so this is very important also to understand. And of course, not only stress could be the cause of this disorder. There are many other mechanisms which include bacterial infection and blood-brain barrier and several other things. For example, recently it was found that tau hyperphosphorylation starts from locus coeruleus, and this is a part of the brain which is responsible for some particular genetic connections, and the axons from this locus coeruleus spread to olfactory bulb, and they so the tau beta amyloid could be transformed. The tau hyperphosphorylated protein could be transformed to from this place to other, and again spread in the brain. So these mechanisms are not quite well understood yet. So we still need to go deeper in the problems. And but it doesn't mean that when we go deeper, we will better understand. We should go deeper and deeper to develop a drug, because many drugs people invented without any understanding of molecular biological mechanisms. So these two processes are going somewhat in parallel. But for Alzheimer's disease, what is really clear now, that it is a multifactorial health disorder which involves many genetic and non-genetic factors. And the important point is to use the, let's say, wealth of knowledge accumulated in the field of experiments with transgenic animals and cell culture and clinical studies, to put everything together and to develop some comprehensive understanding, integrative kind of model, which maybe could be some in silico model, which I think now it is possible to develop. There are many publications that try to, let's say, to develop this line of research. And their point is that these computer models could compete with animal model systems in certain sense, because it takes much less time to run new experiment, and you don't need to sacrifice animals. You should try just develop very comprehensive model and put all kind of information available about this disorder in such kind of model or systems of models. So I think that's interesting possible directions of research in this area as well. And translation of results of molecular biological studies on animals to humans. I think what people don't quite understand, people who study genetic epidemiology, that all our ideas, all our connections about ideas about development of Alzheimer's disease and related dementia, maybe other diseases, came from experimental studies. They need to be verified in humans. And in humans, there are not so many data to verify these connections. What we have often observational data, and if there is no causality in this data, we should develop special tests to check the causality of detected connections. And of course, we should probably try to connect additional data focused specifically on Alzheimer's disease-related biomarkers and look at this data again longitudinally. I think we have potential to develop such kind of stuff, but we should not have illusions that it's simple, that it's easy, and that we already close to the solution of the problem. So far, I think there is a very good progress in the field, but we still far from understanding how to treat the Alzheimer and how to prevent. Also, in the recent studies show that there are some trends in Alzheimer prevalence, and these trends indicate that there are some controlled factors which we don't quite understand yet, but we could really focus on the analysis of such kind of data. One of our grants, I think for Eric Stellert as a PI, is focused on such kind of ideas. So I think it's interesting direction of research. There's a lot of interesting ideas and insight from different fields.
Thank you, Anatoly. This is exactly what I wanted to ask you. Actually, my question would be about a perspective of creating mechanistic models based on ideas you described. So, and this is what you commented. Thank you.
Okay.
So maybe we can ask Alexander to respond to question from Ron. Please try.
Okay, sure. So thank you for your question. And as far as I understand, the question is that depending on who was selected for the study, they can be more protected. Again, careers of the four allele can be more protected or less protected, or the study composition can affect the estimates. Is this correct?
At least try to respond,
okay. Yeah.
keeping in mind
in general, as I said, this analysis was performed using 4 studies and in a sample of 4 studies. However, we did analysis in each study separately. We couldn't do this for non-white population because not too many subjects of non-white population were available in those studies, but we did this for whites. And for whites, each study shows the same, well, basically the same pattern, and especially in the TOM40, ApoE, ApoC region. What is important here is that you might be correct that some people carrying E4 allele may not develop dementia, Alzheimer's disease, but this can be because of several reasons. One of them can be they can be more resilient just because of some external factors, but the resilience can be also because of special combination of genes for this group of individuals. However, what is important is that we also examined the difference in LD between older population who were not affected by Alzheimer's disease and a young population. Young population is about 40 years of age. This young enough population which is not affected by mortality selection. So basically, what we observe in this population is basically what we observe in birth in the United States, because mortality in the United States until 60 years is negligible. So the interesting result was that there was no difference in linkage disequilibrium structures in young population and old population, which is not affected by Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's disease is standalone population, which and these structures, complex structure, can indicate can be early markers of Alzheimer's disease, who can be susceptible to Alzheimer's disease later in life. Okay.
Okay, thank you. So look, I think we are ready to move to number 3 topic of our roundtable. And this topic comes from our poll review, poll votes we made yesterday. And people recommended to discuss analytic methods and Medicare data at our roundtable, and probably we should do it now. So there were 2 presentations, 2 review presentations discussing different approaches and compared them. One of them was a presentation of Ricardo Petrabon. Is he here at our roundtable? And
yes, I am.
Oh, hi, Ricardo. So, and
hey, Igor.
Another one was my presentation where I discuss maybe analytic and maybe more traditional approaches. Ricardo discussed artificial intelligence methods. So, and I wanted to ask you, Ricardo, so you discussed these methods and you explained us that we need to have quite huge data set to train neural networks or similar constructions of artificial intelligence. I just thought that maybe if I had this huge data set, maybe it would be sufficient for me to use just usual logistic model rather than neural network. Am not I correct?
Well, so let me just qualify that a little bit. So there's a wide range of different types of machine learning models. And just to, again, step back a little bit, I'm talking about machine learning models, but by and large, let me just start my video here. So machine learning is just a subset of artificial intelligence. So to your first question, do we need very large sample sizes? Well, it depends. It depends on the types of models that you are doing. So, for example, if all you're using are just, data frame types of variables, so claims data, registries, cohort studies, the data sets don't need to be extensive. They can be, moderate sizes. So, for example, most of the data sets that were displayed by Dr. Jones in her previous presentation a few minutes ago, I think they would be eligible for machine learning. However, if you start using multiple types of data sets, so for example, if you want to fuse imaging data with omics data and electronic health records or cohort studies, then the sample sizes tend to increase. I think that, one of the big differences between evaluating prediction and evaluating causation, which is what most of the studies in this, the presentations over the 2 days did, is that whenever you're evaluating prediction, you have to validate your prediction in multiple subsets using cross-validation, splitting the data. There's an infinity of different methods. So again, to qualify the question, it depends. For some of the this framework or spreadsheet type of data, you don't need that large of a data set. Whenever you start fusing different types of data, then it becomes more data hungry, if you will. Now, to your second question, logistic regression versus machine learning. From a machine learning perspective, logistic regression is one of what we call classification models. So if you have a dependent variable or an endogenous variable or an outcome variable that is dichotomous, oftentimes logistic regression will perform either as well or nearly as well as machine learning models. So it is an option. However, logistic regression, as we all know, it can only model certain types of data. So your outcome variable needs to be dichotomous. So again, it depends. If your outcome is continuous, if you have an ordinal variable, if you have multivariate types of models, then other types of machine learning models will apply. One of the big, I think, differences in terms of frequentist and statistical analysis and machine learning is that frequentist statistical analysis tends to be more prescriptive. If you have a dichotomous outcome, there, you can use log it, you can use prob it, etc. When it comes to machine learning, a lot of people have described this as kind of an alchemy. So in other words, you try multiple types of modeling, and whatever fits the data set better will be your choice. So rather than looking at assumptions of the underlying model or things like that. So going with the logistic regression is not wrong at all. I think what would probably might be a mistake is to set your mind from the get-go that logistic regression is the way to go and not try other things.
Ricardo, look, let's compare task formulation for my approach and your approach. Let's consider Medicare data, for example, yeah? I would like to say something about disparities. I observe, using my Medicare data, I observe disparities in prevalence, for example, and in mortality. I use a sequence of decomposition approaches like partitioning, like Blinder-Aksakal, like something like this, in order to reduce these complex disparities to clearly interpreted quantities like incidence and risk factor of this incidence. And finally, I can say something about the role of each risk factors, maybe clinic related, maybe not clinic related, but I can, I demonstrated a table. I can say that 30% has this specific mechanism resulting in this contribution to disparities. And this, and this. I can classify this effect. So how would you formulate the tasks for artificial intelligence approaches for Medicare data? Could you please give us a couple of examples?
Sure, absolutely. I think that, if I am trying to tackle a problem, I think my first concept would be to differentiate between causal modeling and prediction modeling, because these are completely different. So the traditional example is, and this is going to sound a little funny, but a house on fire. If I'm trying to find the cause for a house on fire, I might be looking for a short circuit or a candle or a fireplace. That's a cause. If I'm trying to predict whether a house is on fire, I might be looking for fire trucks that are running in a certain direction. So these are completely different approaches. So if I'm trying to do, in the examples you gave, I believe they are all leaning towards causal inferences rather than prediction. If I am talking about prediction, primarily in terms of disparities, I am likely going to be talking about decision support. It's less about trying to understand the causal structure of the phenomenon as a whole, but I'm trying to provide predictions that will assist, for example, healthcare policymakers. So if I'm predicting that a certain number of patients are going to have more complications that are related to, for example, race, well, I need a decision support system. If I am looking, however, at causality, there's a subset of machine learning models that will serve my purposes. Usually, the steps towards that are as follows. Number one, as usual, you start with like a lot of exploratory data analysis. I think this is true for both approaches, causal and prediction. You really, really, really need to have a deep understanding of the relationships among all variables before you start modeling. But again, this is common for any type of modeling approach. If I am talking then about causal machine learning, the initial step is usually a very in-depth review of the literature, doing something that I think is also fairly familiar to causal researchers, which is directed acyclic graphs. So, short reviews of the literature, understanding the relationship among each one of the predictors, the relationship between predictors and the outcomes that you are trying to predict. Next step, we model usually on average the individual bivariate analysis. So again, trying to understand those things. From that point on, there's a wide range of causal machine learning models, and that will depend on exactly what you're trying to do. If you want to stick to DAGs or directed acyclic graph models, there are things like, for example, Bayesian networks, where the end product is not only a prediction for individual patients, but as well as you are able to identify the individual causes for individual patients. Now, I think this is a crucial difference between the traditional causal inference model from statistics and machine learning. In causal statistics, essentially you are comparing groups. Whether I'm doing a randomized trial, whether I'm analyzing SEER Medicare or CMS 5% or 100%, I'm comparing one group versus another group. In machine learning, causal machine learning, I am making predictions and I'm evaluating causes for individuals. So for example, if I have John in front of me, and I think that John is being affected by a disparity, I'm going to be looking for the reasons why John might have been affected. Are these social determinants of health? Are these related to his race? Are these related to his being treated at a rural or urban area? But it comes down to DAGs. And then the final step, which is also very important, a difference between the statistical approach and the machine learning approach, is the validation. So as I mentioned yesterday during my presentation, machine learning it's basically trying to train an algorithm to behave similar to a data set. Usually the metaphor that I use for this is a toddler. So if you think about a toddler and you're trying to teach a toddler something, first you show her, second you ask a few questions to see to which extent she understood whatever you're trying to teach her, and then finally you release her in the world and she's going to be using her knowledge. It's exactly the same thing with machine learning models. So the training is done for the algorithm to learn the patterns in whatever data set. As I mentioned yesterday, if you're training an algorithm using SEER Medicare, for example, you have to be careful because the algorithm is going to learn everything about that data set. including the biases, including the disparities. Number two, you test the model to see the machine learning model to see how much it learned and if it learned well. And number three, you release it into the world, for example, in a decision support system.
May I ask a question?
Please.
Okay, thank you. Something you just said is extremely interesting to me. You mentioned the sensitivity of algorithms picking up disparities and other elements of that data set. And I want to stay with that point for a second and ask, what would be, from your experience or perhaps other colleagues who do this work on a regular basis, what would be some strategies for mitigating the effects of potentially replicating the very disparities you're trying to redress? And thinking about from a team science perspective, if you will, and the partnerships that you are building to kind of think through your questions and your approaches, how would you go about building a team that can help you identify those things proactively so that you're not replicating the very disparities you're trying to redress?
So Dr. Jones, I think this is probably the central question of the next 10 to 20 years, how to address disparities in machine learning models. I think that, because machine learning models and artificial intelligence, they're becoming so pervasive in our day-to-day, they're absolutely everywhere. There's a huge risk, and this is not a theoretical risk, it's a risk that we're facing right now, that machine learning models will be learning and, in a sense, perpetuating disparities if they keep learning unassisted, if you will. Unfortunately, to this day, there are no perfect approaches to mitigating that just using quantitative analysis. Yesterday, I presented one graphic from my group where by combining machine learning models and a method that's usually associated with propensity scores, which is called inverse probability weighting, you can actually decrease the disparity in the final decision support system by a certain percentage. However, it does not remove that bias. I made another point yesterday, and I think this will go to the core of your question, which is, as researchers, as of today, we tend to put a lot of emphasis on our own results. In other words, if my results are showing a certain amount of disparity, I am immediately assuming that that's going to be propagated and that's there's nothing to be done. In reality, whenever you start transferring, or I should use the word implementing your algorithms into the real world, there's a number of other opportunities for us to be nudging clinicians, policymakers, in order to correct for those disparities. I believe that going straight to your point, I think there's an absolute need for collaboration among three types of researchers: artificial intelligence researchers, researchers who work with disparity and causal inference, and number three, implementation science researchers. Because by having the combination of these three groups, I think we're going to be addressing a lot of these problems. I want to, in my slides yesterday, I had an example which to me was absolutely shocking. There are multiple ways of actually transferring disparities into algorithms from machine learning. And you can do this whenever you're trying to predict complications or whenever you're trying to predict risk of a future condition. But there's no way that's more, how can I say, sure to propagate disparities than when you are trying to predict if a given patient should or not have a certain treatment. This has tremendous implications, especially in our age where value-based care is basically driving decisions across the board. If you have a decision, a machine learning algorithm that learned from a biased data set, and all of our data sets at this point, we have more than 30 years of research demonstrating that Medicare, everything, we're making biased decisions. If our algorithms are learning that, and that's being propagated, we're doomed. For the next 20 years, there's a risk that, disparities would be increased. So I think there's an absolute need for collaboration among all of these people, especially when artificial intelligence researchers are working alone. Yesterday in my slides, I had I presented one example of an outstanding group from UCSF, a group of biomedical engineers. And by the way, I should say this, what I'm going to be saying now is absolutely not a criticism to that group. But essentially what they did was to combine imaging data with, now I can't remember if it was electronic health record or some claims data, where they were predicting whether patients should or not have a total knee replacement. Now, honestly, I don't even need to look at their data. It's a given. It definitely most likely has disparities. Did they do that on purpose? Absolutely not. I'm nearly 100% sure that they didn't have that intention, but they need to collaborate with researchers doing disparity research who understand the phenomenon. They do need to work with implementation scientists so that we can mitigate the problem rather than enhance it.
That is a fantastic and thorough answer to the question. I really appreciate your thoughtful reflections on yesterday's discussion and your experience overall. Thank you very much.
Dr. Jones,
Thank
can
you.
I have a question to you concerning your presentation? So you describe as the role of Office of Special Population, but look, if we submit arrow 1 to NIA focused on disparity, what is the role of this office comparing to behavior studies section, for example? Could you please clarify?
Absolutely. So going back to my opening remarks yesterday, the role of the Office of Special Populations is really to catalyze the research more broadly across the entire institute. So if you think of the institute as like an octopus with lots of arms, all these arms have something to do with health disparities as it pertains to aging research. And depending on the question and the endpoints may be managed by different divisions: behavioral social research, neuroscience, the geriatrics, clinical geriatrics, and our aging biology. Those divisions are programmatic divisions. So that ultimately is where a funded grant will sit, and the program officer will be in one of those 4 places. But my office and our charge is really to catalyze the direction, the focus, and the activities, making opportunities across the institute more broadly available, harmonizing efforts.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, and that becomes important, partly what Dr. Petrobon was speaking to, as different aspects of a field mature at different rates. It's helpful to have a general focus and direction, kind of moving things along as it pertains to health disparities, so that we truly can start making advances in a more expeditious fashion. So working across the institute.
Thank you. Thank you. So we also had another poll today. We asked our audience to choose the most important reason for that generates disparities, and number 1 was chosen as socioeconomic factors. And after Julia's presentation, we discussed this choice in the light of a review she demonstrated. And we concluded that maybe we should consider interaction between these factors with healthcare factors and something like this. This is what we concluded, and also the point why we have specific disparities was the number 2 of our first poll when we discussed when we asked what to discuss at our round table. So we are almost done with the round table, and let me suggest one more poll before we can finish our before we can finish our round table and go to presentation of Dr. Stern. Please see and please vote. Goldie, do you have some questions, some points, maybe in this last minutes of our roundtable? We have 2 more minutes before we can go to keynote presentation.
I do have a question, Igor. Thank you so much. And I really appreciated the round table and filling in some of the gaps and questions that we had. Very intrigued by Dr. Pietrobone's responses as well. But Dr. Jones, this is to you. How do we address the very issue that you raised? In other words, I was on a recent panel for National Science Foundation around this same issue around, it was artificial intelligence and health disparities and addressing those social determinants of health as we create algorithms for AI. And so how going forward, if we're 30 years behind with regard to making sure, with regard to inclusion of this very important element, how do we start from here? Where do we go from here? How do investigators, how does NIH assure that we now plug into this pipeline to assure that we're not creating a bigger problem, as you say, than we already have, basically? This is a very big concern because we are making predictions and we're doing medicine and it is very scary when we think of patient outcomes and the overall health outcomes of people, particularly people of color, who've not been particularly included enough in research and studies, and now here in AI. It's just a tremendously scary thought.
I can fully appreciate the concern, which is why I posed the question. And to answer your question, you might recall I used the phrase team science, and yes. I would point back to that because I really think that cannot be understated enough or stated enough. The rich, diverse perspectives that different disciplines bring to a science or a body of science that may not seem obvious. So in the context of artificial intelligence or machine learning, I mean, clearly people would think of engineering and computer scientists as subject matter experts. It may not be altogether obvious that an implementation scientist would have a role to play. And I particularly appreciated Dr. Pietrobone mentioning that because oftentimes there's a myth or a misunderstanding or a difference of opinion that implementation science is really a population level T3, T4 kind of activity that happens later on after you have an efficacious discovery and now you're ready to scale up. I don't necessarily ascribe to that particular school of thought individually. I'll just speak for myself. I've been involved with community engagement, implementation science, and other areas related to disparities research and redressing disparities for over 26 years. And I can tell you that there's a place for everyone along the spectrum of all phases of research to consider the perspectives an implementation scientist brings to the conversation. And to the extent that we think more broadly about our respective swim lane, we actually may just make progress in moving along a little faster and be positioned to pass the baton on to the next group of researchers to ask more in-depth questions. But I really think if we could embrace the diversity of a research team, that wouldn't be the obvious first conclusion, that just may be our way forward in not replicating the very mistakes and misperceptions that we're at risk of doing so.
Absolutely. And should those, from your perspective, should those research teams include members of the very target populations that we have, where we have interest?
Absolutely. And again, oftentimes there's a perception that when we say community, that word becomes very broad and maybe analogous to a number of things. It may be a layperson, it may be a community of clinical scientists, it may take on lots of different groups, but whomever you're intending to engage and expect to be the end user, we've been saying this for over 2 decades. Certainly the expectation is that they are at the table from the beginning all the way through, intimately involved in decisions, not just at points that are convenient for the researcher. It's convenient to have the community advisory board. It's convenient to have them weigh in on public service announcements, but all the way through in terms of questions. What is truly pressing? What are truly the issues? And where are we experiencing challenges that, you know, when we look at our literature, it takes a while for it to be fully described and discussed in literature. So this is our opportunity to hear firsthand from the end user, what are some issues that we can address in a study that's being developed and conceptualized ahead of the problem.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for all participants of our round table.